Picture the stage, blinding spotlights slicing through the smoky air of the 1970s, the roaring crowds, the sequined gowns, the flawless, tailor-made suits. When you think of the golden era of soul music, your mind immediately rushes to the titans, the untouchable gods of the Motown empire. You think of the velvet smoothness of Marvin Gaye, and the raw, vulnerable perfection of Tammy Terrell standing shoulder to shoulder, their voices blending into pure, electrifying magic. You envision the absolute glamour and reigning majesty of Diana Ross, commanding sold-out stadiums with a single, graceful sweep of her hand. These weren't just singers. They were global icons. And the songs they sang? They weren't just tracks pressed onto a vinyl record. They were the undisputed, immortal anthems of human connection. Ain't no mountain high enough. You're all I need to get by. Just reading those titles probably plays the soaring melodies in your head right now. These are the masterpieces that defined entire generations. They are the cultural monoliths played at literally millions of weddings, anniversary dinners, and first dances around the globe. They are the background music to our greatest love stories. The industry crowned these performers as ultimate royalty, showering them with platinum plaques, magazine toffenpies, and a level of adulation most human beings couldn't even begin to fathom. We look at Marvin, Tammy, and Diana, and we see the absolute pinnacle of musical genius. We have been sold a story of glittering perfection, an unchallenged narrative where the beautiful people holding the microphones are the undisputed architects of the magic. But what if I told you that the narrative is a beautifully packaged illusion? What if I told you that the very soul, the beating heart, and the profound poetry of those towering global hits didn't originate in a lavish Detroit mansion or a multi-million-dollar recording studio? Stop for a second and really imagine this. Imagine that the colossal aura surrounding these musical deities, the profound lyrics that made millions of people fall in love, the very words that gave Diana Ross her soaring solo wings, were, in a way, borrowed from a ghost. What if the true architect of the greatest love songs of the 20th century wasn't a pampered industry insider, but a desperate, starving young man who didn't even have a roof over his head? It sounds like absolute fiction, doesn't it? It sounds completely insane to think that the genius who penned the soundtrack for the world's most glamorous superstars was actually a homeless drifter wandering the unforgiving, freezing streets of New York City. While the world was preparing to dance to his melodies in glittering, champagne-filled ballrooms, he was silently shivering. He was looking for an unlocked door, just trying to find a hard wooden pew in a Harlem church so he wouldn't have to sleep on the concrete sidewalks. How does a man go from being utterly invisible to writing the absolute DNA of soul music, only for the music industry to let other people wear his hard-earned crown? How does the creator of the world's ultimate anthems remain so criminally overlooked by the very institutions that profited off his pain and his poetry? You know, the timeless songs. You know, the beautiful superstars who sang them. But it is finally time you knew the architect who built the throne they sat on. His name was Nick Ashford. And the true story of how he built an empire from the cold streets of Harlem is going to completely shatter everything you thought you knew. Let's take you back. Way back before the flashing cameras, the tailored suits, and the massive Motown royalty checks. To truly understand the sheer and impossible magnitude of the musical empire Nick Ashford built, you have to stand right where he started, at absolute rock bottom. Born in South Carolina in 1941, Nick's early life was not a fairy tale. His family carried the same suffocating dual burden shouldered by so many black families of that era: the crushing, inescapable weight of systemic racism and the quiet, desperate dignity required just to survive from one day to the next. When his family moved to Harlem, New York, they were looking for a promised land. Instead, they found a concrete jungle that demanded a heavy toll from anyone trying to make it out alive. Harlem in the 1950s and 60s was a living, breathing symphony. If you walked the streets at night, the air was thick with magic. Jazz bleeding out of the open windows of basement clubs. The raw, beautiful harmonies of doo-wop echoing off the brick walls of corner stoops. The pulse of the city was intoxicating. But imagine being surrounded by all that vibrant, thunderous life and feeling completely, utterly invisible. That was young Nicholas. He wasn't a pampered child prodigy. He was a skinny, deeply lonely kid with empty pockets and a head full of dreams that the harsh reality of the streets constantly tried to beat out of him. This is the part of his story that forces you to pause and reevaluate everything. By the early 1960s, the man whose pen would later generate millions of dollars and define an entire genre had absolutely nothing. Nick found himself homeless, drifting like a ghost through the merciless, freezing streets of New York City. Can you picture the sheer isolation of that? Wandering the towering avenues, invisible to the rushing crowds, scribbling profound, poetic lyrics onto literal scraps of garbage paper because he couldn't even afford a notebook. When the nights got dangerously cold, when the hunger gnawed at him and he had nowhere else to turn, he slipped quietly into the back pews of local churches, wrapping his thin coat tight just to survive until morning. But the universe has a strange way of working in the dark. Those churches became his ultimate refuge, and not just because they provided physical shelter. On Sunday mornings, when the gospel choir started to sing, something inside that shivering, destitute young man woke up. The harmonies weren't just music to him, they were medicine. The thunderous joy of a Harlem gospel choir slamming into his chest taught him a fundamental truth that would change music history forever. A song has the supernatural power to lift a broken human being out of their misery. He absorbed that spiritual fire. He learned that lyrics could be a lifeline. Yet, a spark needs oxygen to become a blazing fire. Nick was still just a homeless wanderer until fate walked through the heavy wooden doors of the White Rock Baptist Church in Harlem. Her name was Valerie Simpson. She wasn't from his world of drifting. She was a brilliant, classically trained young pianist from the Bronx with a voice that could shatter glass. She looked at this tall, ragged, quiet poet, where the rest of the cold world saw a nobody, where society saw a disposable statistic. Valerie looked directly into his eyes and saw a towering genius. She didn't pity him. She recognized him. She believed in him before he even had a reason to believe in himself. When their worlds collided in that church sanctuary, the lonely, invisible boy from the streets finally found his anchor. The spark had found its oxygen. When Nick Ashford and Valerie Simpson locked themselves in the basement of that Harlem church, they weren't trying to become famous. They were just two hungry, desperate artists, armed with nothing but cheap notebooks, worn-out pencils, and an undeniable spurning chemistry. Nick brought the street-level poetry, the raw, bleeding emotions of a man who had seen the absolute bottom of the world. Valerie brought the elegant, soaring musicality, the classical training that could turn his pain into pure majesty. Together, they didn't just write songs, they built emotional cathedrals. The industry didn't see them coming, but once Ray Charles took a chance on their track, Let's Go Get Stoned, and wrote it straight to #1 on the R&B charts in 1966, the whispers started. The music gods were finally listening, and those whispers traveled straight to the undisputed kingdom of soul, Detroit, Motown. Entering Motown in the 1960s wasn't like joining a normal record label. It was stepping into a colossal factory of untouchable legends. It was the impenetrable fortress of Smokey Robinson, the Supremes, and the Temptations. If you somehow managed to get your foot in that door, you weren't just making records, you were literally shaping global culture. Nick and Valerie didn't just knock on that door. Their sheer, undeniable talent kicked it completely off its hinges. They became Motown's secret weapon, the golden pen hidden safely behind the velvet curtain. Look at what they built. Just stop and look at the absolute staggering magnitude of their empire. They wrote the blueprint. They wrote the magic. They wrote Ain't No Mountain High Enough in 1967, transforming Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell into immortal celestial beings of romance. They wrote You're All I Need to Get By, a song so profoundly deep it felt like a sacred, unbreakable vow. They wrote Ain't Nothing Like the Real Thing, an anthem so universally perfect that it defied gravity, hit after hit, anthem after anthem, masterpiece after masterpiece. They weren't just writing catchy pop tunes. They were writing testimonies of Black love, resilience, and spiritual triumph during the absolute peak of the civil rights movement. They knew exactly how to tailor a lyric to fit Marvin's effortless, seductive smoothness. They knew exactly how to bend a melody to cradle Tammy's heartbreaking vulnerability. And when Diana Ross needed a solo anthem to launch her into the stratosphere in 1970, who did the Motown machine call? They called the formerly homeless boy from the streets and the piano prodigy from the Bronx. They handed Diana Ain't No Mountain High Enough, and it catapulted her straight to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The exact same magnificent song, written by the exact same invisible poet, carried two different legendary careers to unimaginable, history-making heights. But here is where the story turns agonizing. Here is the suffocating paradox that should make your chest tight. Nick and Valerie were manufacturing the very heartbeat of the world. Their profound words were echoing out of radios in every city on Earth, filling massive stadiums, scoring thousands of weddings, and bringing hope to millions of marginalized people who desperately needed to hear that love was solid. Yet, the average person singing their lyrics at the top of their lungs had absolutely no idea who they were. Imagine the sheer crushing psychological weight of that injustice. Imagine writing the ultimate soundtrack to millions of human lives, generating untold wealth for massive corporate labels and legendary vocalists, and then walking down a crowded New York City street as a complete nobody. Imagine standing in a grocery store line, hearing your own blood, sweat, and soul pouring out of the ceiling speakers, while the person standing right next to you doesn't even glance your way. The singer's got the blazing spotlights, the screaming crowds, the glossy magazine covers, and the eternal glory. Nick Ashford got a royalty check and a permanent place in the shadows. He was a king without a recognized kingdom. Motown insiders respected them deeply as the duo with the golden touch. But the outside world? The world remained completely, blissfully oblivious to the towering architect behind the curtain. Nick and Valerie had written enough classic hits to comfortably retire, but a fierce fire was building in Nick's chest. You cannot cage a voice that powerful forever. The agonizing frustration of being a faceless ghost was mounting, compressing like a tightly coiled spring, preparing for an explosive, undeniable rebellion. But a fire that massive, that deeply rooted, cannot be contained in a basement forever. You cannot keep absolute lightning trapped in a bottle. By the 1970s, the suffocating, agonizing frustration of being faceless ghosts reached its absolute breaking point. Nick Ashford and Valerie Simpson looked at the staggering multi-million-dollar empire they had built for everyone else, and they made a radical, undeniable decision. They were entirely done hiding. They were done handing over their bleeding souls for other voices to sing. It was time to step out from behind that heavy velvet Motown curtain and walk directly into the blinding, glorious spotlight. And man, when they finally stepped onto that stage, the entire world felt the tectonic plates of the music industry shift. The establishment didn't even know how to process them at first. Nick and Valerie weren't a manufactured bubblegum pop act perfectly packaged by a corporate boardroom. They were breathtakingly, fiercely authentic. Picture them on stage right now. Nick, towering and unbelievably regal, with his long, flowing mane of hair and sharply tailored suits, looking like absolute soul royalty. He didn't just sing, he testified. He would close his eyes, throw his head back, and let that booming, majestic baritone rattle the rafters. And right beside him was Valerie, elegant, radiant, commanding the piano keys with the relentless fire of a classical virtuoso. They didn't need million-dollar stage props. They didn't need flashy choreography or laser light shows. Because what they possessed on that stage was something you cannot fake, you cannot buy, and you cannot manufacture in a studio. They had the absolute, unfiltered truth. Every single time Nick looked across the microphone at Valerie, every time she smiled back at him mid-verse, the audience was paralyzed by the sheer electric intimacy of it all. This wasn't a PR stunt. This wasn't a fake industry showmance cooked up to sell vinyl records. This was a real, deeply rooted, fiercely protective marriage put completely on display. They were finally singing their own diaries out loud. They were showing the entire world a breathtaking portrait of Black love, Black excellence, and undeniable, unbreakable partnership. And then, the 1980s arrived. The foundation was set, the tension was tightly coiled, and they were finally ready to drop the absolute hammer. In 1984, they released a track that didn't just climb the charts. It completely conquered the globe. Solid. Just say the word, and the groove instantly hits your chest. Solid, solid as a rock. That song wasn't just a catchy melody, it was a massive global manifesto. It was a triumphant, euphoric anthem for every single couple who had ever weathered a vicious storm and come out the other side holding hands. It blasted out of every radio on Earth, filled every stadium, and dominated MTV. Look at the music video, shot right in the middle of Central Park. No green screens, no gimmicks. Just Nick and Valerie moving through a massive crowd of real New Yorkers, radiating pure, infectious joy. They had finally done it. They had smashed the glass ceiling to pieces. The homeless boy from Harlem and the piano prodigy from the Bronx were no longer the secret ghostwriters. They were global icons. They were household names. They were standing at the absolute, glittering pinnacle of the music universe, bathed in the warm, euphoric glow of their own hard-earned triumph. The world was finally screaming their names. It was the perfect, glorious, happily ever after ending. Or at least, that is exactly what it was supposed to be. You would think that after stepping out from the heavy, suffocating velvet curtains of the Motown hit factory, the story would seamlessly transition into a glorious, golden-hued Hollywood ending. You would naturally assume that after Nick Ashford and Valerie Simpson finally released Solid in 1984, a monumental, unstoppable juggernaut of a track that conquered the global charts and became the definitive, unshakable anthem for unbreakable love, the world would finally rightfully bow down. You picture the red carpets rolling out. You imagine the heavy brass trophies lining their mantelpiece. You envision a world where the previously homeless boy from Harlem is finally carried on the shoulders of the industry he helped build. You would think that the moment they proved they weren't just the ghostwriters behind the magic, but the magnificent voices delivering it, the gates of the musical pantheon would swing wide open. But this is where the fairy tale shatters. This is where the glittering illusion of the music industry is brutally stripped away, leaving behind a reality so profoundly frustrating and deeply agonizing that it will make your blood boil. While millions of ordinary people across the globe were swaying to Solid, holding their partners tight and singing Nick's words back into the night sky, the ultimate gatekeepers of musical history simply crossed their arms and looked the other way. The establishment, with its closed-door committees and glittering elitism, remained stubbornly, deafeningly silent. Let's talk about the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Every single day, millions of tourists walk down Hollywood Boulevard, stepping on the brass stars of thousands of entertainers. Many of those stars belong to celebrities who had one fleeting moment of fame, a single hit television show, or a brief flash of viral relevance. Yet if you walk up and down those legendary sidewalks searching for the names Nick Ashford and Valerie Simpson, the architects who literally wrote the soundtrack of the 20th century, the geniuses who gave Diana Ross her wings, who gave Marvin Gaye his ultimate romantic frequency, who gave Chaka Khan her power, you will find absolutely nothing. Blank concrete. How is that physically possible? Yeah. How do you write "On No Mountain High Enough"? A song that is practically etched into the DNA of the human race, and not get a star on the ground? And what about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Year after year, decade after decade, the induction ceremonies would roll around. Year after year, bands and artists who grew up intensely studying the Ashford and Simpson blueprint were ushered into the hall, draped in accolades and crowned as immortal legends. And year after year, Nick Ashford's name was quietly, systematically left off the ballot. It is a stunning, almost violent level of institutional disrespect. This wasn't just a simple oversight, it was a glaring reflection of a systemic bias. The industry has always had a devastating habit of treating R&B songwriters, especially black creators, as disposable machinery. They love the product, they profit endlessly off the genius, they dance to the rhythm, but they refuse to honor the pioneer. Nick Ashford had to carry himself with quiet, regal grace while watching a parade of lesser artists bask in the blinding spotlights that his very own words had powered. He had to live with the suffocating knowledge that he was universally heard, yet institutionally invisible. But if you thought the cold, bureaucratic indifference of the elite music industry was the climax of Nick Ashford's struggles, you were entirely unprepared for the sheer, devastating cruelty that fate had waiting in the wings. Because the universe, in its most unfathomable and agonizing irony, did not just attack his legacy, It attacked his physical essence. It attacked the very instrument that had defined his entire existence on this earth. In the late 2000s, after decades of fighting for his rightful place in history, Nick Ashford was diagnosed with throat cancer. I need you to pause and let the sheer, horrific weight of that specific diagnosis truly sink into your bones. This was not just a medical tragedy. It felt like a cruel, targeted cosmic joke. Of all the illnesses in the world, the disease went directly for his throat, the throat of a man whose entire life was built on breath, resonance, and voice. Think about the profound, poetic tragedy of this. This was the exact same vocal cord that hummed the very first melodies of You're All I Need to Get By in a freezing Harlem church. This was the throat that projected a booming, majestic baritone across sold-out stadiums, telling millions of marginalized people that their love was solid as a rock. His voice was his ultimate superpower. It was the bridge between his brilliant soul and the outside world. And now, a vicious, unforgiving cellular rebellion was aggressively attempting to silence him forever. The disease began to ruthlessly strip away his physical power. The tall, striking, regal figure who used to command the stage with flowing hair and boundless electric energy began to grow terrifyingly frail. His towering baritone, which once rattled the walls of concert halls, was slowly, agonizingly reduced to a fragile, raspy whisper. The physical toll of the radiation, the chemotherapy, the endless hospital visits, it was a brutal, exhausting war of attrition that threatened to completely break his spirit. Imagine the psychological torment of that reality. You are a master of words, but it hurts to speak. You are a legend of melody, but you can no longer sing. You've been ignored by the industry's highest halls of honor, and now your own body is betraying you. This is the exact moment where a lesser man would have completely surrendered. This is the breaking point where a broken artist would have retreated deep into the shadows, consumed by dark, venomous bitterness, cursing the industry that ignored him and the vicious disease that was slowly suffocating him. But Nick Ashford was not a lesser man. He was a king, forged in the freezing, unforgiving streets of Harlem. He did not want your pity. He didn't want a tragic, weeping narrative. He did not view himself as a victim, and he absolutely refused to let the world view him as one. Instead of begging for a seat at the music industry's elite tables, instead of waiting for a validation that was never going to come, Nick and Valerie made a decision that defines the true essence of their towering greatness. Then the decided to build their own magnificent table. They didn't retreat from the world. They created a sanctuary for it. In the heart of Manhattan's Upper West Side, they opened a place called the Sugar Bar. The Sugar Bar was not just a restaurant. It was not a vanity project for a fading celebrity. It was a living, breathing fortress of defiance. It was a sacred temple of soul music. Walk through those doors, and you weren't stepping into a commercial establishment. You were stepping straight into the warm, beating heart of Nick and Valerie's living room. The air was thick with the smell of soul food, the glow of dim amber lighting, and the electric hum of pure, unfiltered creativity. At the Sugar Bar, there were no industry gatekeepers. There were no elitist award committees deciding who was worthy and who was not. There was only the stage, the microphone, and the truth. Nick and Valerie built this space specifically to nurture the next generation of talent. On any given Tuesday night, you could walk in and see an absolutely terrified, unknown 19-year-old kid from the Bronx gripping the microphone for the very first time. And if you looked over to the corner booth, sitting quietly in the shadows, you would see Nick Ashford. Even as the throat cancer violently ravaged his body, even as he lost the physical weight and the booming volume of his youth, Nick kept showing up. That is the image that should bring tears to your eyes. Not tears of sorrow, but tears of absolute, staggering awe. Here is a man fighting a terminal illness, robbed of his own legendary voice. Yet he is sitting in the back of his own club, using his fading energy to nod along to the rhythm of a nervous teenager trying to find their voice. He couldn't sing the high notes anymore, but he was making damn sure that the next generation had a safe platform to sing theirs. He took the immense pain of his own erasure, the sting of the Walk of Fame snubs, the bitterness of the Rock Hall rejections, and he miraculously transmuted it into pure, unconditional generosity. He ensured that no young artist who stepped onto the stage of the Sugar Bar would ever feel as invisible as he once felt sleeping in those Harlem pews. He couldn't control the cancer, and he couldn't control the industry, but he could absolutely control his legacy. And his legacy was going to be one of radical, defiant love. Valerie stood right by his side through every agonizing second of this brutal storm. The love they had sung about for decades, the love that was solid as a rock, was no longer just a catchy chorus on a vinyl record. It was the stark, beautiful reality of a wife holding her dying husband's frail hand in sterile hospital rooms. It was Valerie gracefully taking over the heavy lifting on stage at the Sugar Bar, playing the piano with fierce, protective devotion, while Nick watched her with eyes full of an adoration that transcended physical decline. Their marriage became their ultimate masterpiece, infinitely more profound than any song they ever wrote. They proved that true love doesn't just survive the spotlight. It survives the absolute darkest valleys of the shadow of death. Nick Ashford fought with a quiet, devastating dignity. There were no dramatic, attention-seeking press conferences about his health. There were no desperate pleas for late-career sympathy awards. He handled his mortality with the exact same regal elegance he brought to his music. He simply continued to pour whatever life he had left into the people around him until there was nothing left to pour. On August 22, 2011, surrounded by his family in a New York hospital, Nick Ashford drew his final breath. He was 70 years old. When the news of his passing broke, it sent a massive, reverberating shockwave through the global music community. Suddenly, the industry that had so often ignored him was scrambling to pay tribute. The airwaves were instantly flooded with "Ain't No Mountain High Enough" and "Solid." Superstars took to television to mourn the loss of a genius. But for the true fans, for the people who really knew his story, the tributes felt incredibly bittersweet. Where were all these loud praises when he was alive? Why does the establishment only realize the towering size of the giant once he has finally fallen? The tragedy of his death forcefully reopened the gaping wound of his lack of recognition. The internet was flooded with outraged comments from fans demanding justice, asking how a man who single-handedly engineered the golden era of R&B could die without the highest honors of his profession. But if you look closely at how Nick Ashford chose to spend his final years, you realize something incredibly profound. He didn't die waiting for their validation. He didn't pass away looking longingly at a blank square of Hollywood concrete. He died knowing he had built something infinitely more permanent than a brass star. He built a community. He built a sanctuary. He built a legacy of music that will outlive the very award institutions that ignored him. He lost his physical voice to a ruthless disease, yes, but his spiritual voice, the emotional frequency he injected into the world, that is completely, undeniably immortal. The industry may have stolen his spotlight, the cancer may have stolen his breath, but absolutely nothing on this earth could steal his towering, majestic soul. So, when the stage lights finally fade, when the roaring crowds go home, and when the final notes of a magnificent life gently ring out into the silence, what is the true measure of a man's legacy? The music industry might have its heavily guarded, gated communities. It has its exclusive voting committees, its glittering glass trophies, and its gleaming brass stars embedded in the Hollywood concrete. For decades, those institutions dictated who was a legend and who was merely a footnote. They decided that Nick Ashford, the absolute mastermind behind the golden era of Motown, the poet who gave soul music its very vocabulary of love, was somehow not worthy of their highest pedestals. But as we look back at the incredible, sprawling tapestry of Nick Ashford's life, from the freezing, desolate streets of Harlem to the warm, glowing sanctuary of the Sugar Bar, a beautiful and undeniable truth emerges. Nick Ashford achieved something that absolutely no boardroom committee can ever vote on, and no engraved plaque can ever possibly capture. He bypassed the industry establishment entirely and achieved total, unbreakable cultural immortality. He didn't need a star on the Walk of Fame because his words are permanently etched into the hearts of millions of human beings. Every single time a nervous young couple steps onto a wooden dance floor for their very first dance as husband and wife to the soaring strings of "Ain't No Mountain High Enough," Nick Ashford is right there in the room with them, Every time a new young generation discovers a gritty hip-hop sample of "You're All I Need to Get By" and feels the profound weight of those lyrics, his spirit is breathing life into that moment. Every time the opening bass line of Solid echoes through a family cookout, a wedding reception, or a late-night radio broadcast, and people instinctively pull their loved ones a little closer, that is Nick Ashford's eternal heartbeat. Valerie Simpson, his ultimate muse and lifelong partner, continues to carry that magnificent torch. When she sits at the piano today, her fingers dancing across the keys, she isn't just playing songs, she is keeping a vow. She is ensuring that the fire they ignited together in that Harlem church basement never, ever goes out. Their love story proved that you can create legends for other people, you can be robbed of your rightful spotlight, and you can even lose your physical voice to a devastating illness. But true, authentic soul can never be silenced. Now, I'm turning the microphone directly over to you. Because the reality is, the fans, the people who actually live, breathe, and heal through this music are the true Hall of Fame. You are the ultimate gatekeepers of cultural history. Do you believe the music industry committed a historic injustice? Do you think it is finally time for Nick Ashford and Valerie Simpson to get that long overdue star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame? Should they be immediately inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame to rightfully stand beside the very superstars whose careers they built? I want you to go down into the comments right now and let your voice be heard. Demand the respect this genius deserves. And while you are down there, tell me, what is the one Nick Ashford song that still hits you deep in your soul every single time you hear it? Drop your memories, share your stories, and hit that share button to make sure this legendary architect of soul is never forgotten. Nick Ashford may have been the shadow behind the glory, but in our hearts, his light will outshine them all forever.